With all of Trump's crimes, cons, abuses, and all the terror that this regime is inflicting both here and abroad, why hasn't Trump been impeached and removed? Why wasn't Trump removed when he was impeached the first 2 times? Why is it that members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, are not doing their job of checking the power of an obviously tyrannical president? Well, when you look at the history of how social change actually happens, I think there's a very clear reason why it isn't happening right now. It's because those of us who want this to stop, I'll call us the pro-democracy coalition, everyone from liberals, leftists, progressives, to honest conservatives, and never Trump Republicans. Those of us in the pro-democracy coalition do not pose a threat to our representatives. The Trump-supporting far right absolutely does. Posing a threat to the people in power, and it could be a non-violent threat, we'll get to that, but posing some kind of threat to the people in power is the way that political change happens. That's what history teaches us, and it's something that the mainstream will not talk about. People in the mainstream act like what we need to do is persuade our leaders to do the right thing. Call your representative and let them know how you feel, as if that novel information will change their beliefs and then spur them to do something about it. But for the most part, our leaders do not suffer from a lack of information. They could listen to us if they wanted to. What they lack is the incentive to act in our interests. Politics is a game of power. Moving our political leaders isn't about persuasion, it's about pressure. Pressure? People in power usually do whatever it takes to maintain that power. So our job is not to change our politicians' beliefs, it's to change their calculation. It's to demonstrate through our actions, not just our words, that if they think they're going to stand by and let this happen and still maintain their position in society, then they'd better think again. That means that we the people need to be organized, courageous, and clear about the consequences of crossing us. And unlike the far right, we should be doing this non-violently. After all, we are the pro-democracy coalition. But in order to do that, our resistance strategy will need 3 key elements. In learning from history, we can see that all 3 of these elements contributed to the victories of the civil rights movement. It wasn't just the marches and boycotts. And the 3rd crucial element is something that people don't talk nearly enough about. Hey, I'm Ahsante, and here's what I've been thinking. If you're new here, welcome. On this channel, we're imagining a better political future by looking at how systems of power actually work and what we the people need for society to thrive. So this insight follows after the legendary anti-slavery activist Frederick Douglass. As he famously said, power concedes nothing without demand. If we want to make our politicians do what we want them to do, then the 3 elements of our strategy that we need are a demand, a credible threat, and an alternative. Let me explain. You can break this down into an if-then statement about consequences. If you don't do what we want, that's the demand, so we need to be clear about what specifically we want to get out of this. Then we will remove our power and stop supporting you. That's the threat. This is the 2nd element. And to understand this part, you have to understand that anyone who's in a leadership position in our society is in that position because we've collectively given them that power. Leaders stop being leaders if we stop following them. Shops go out of business if we stop working for them and stop buying from them. Politicians lose their authority if we challenge it, stop voting for them, or stop following their rules. So, to a large extent, we've given people the power that they have over us. This can be a hard pill to swallow because it makes us partially responsible for what's going on, because we've let people use us in certain ways. But it's also empowering because it means that we could, collectively, stop letting ourselves be used. If we're united and organized, we can stop cooperating and shut this whole thing down. Shut it down! That's the nonviolent approach, non-cooperation. And it's actually more powerful than violence because it chokes off power at its source, and it helps build your coalition, because it's more persuasive to neutral parties since nonviolence maintains the moral high ground, especially if it stays strong in the face of violent attack. And yes, the violent attacks will probably be coming, so we're gonna need to be brave. Feel the fear and do it anyway. Violent attacks are designed to scare the population into submission, not to eliminate everyone who disagrees. This is where remembering the specifically American context is important. These are neo-Confederates we're dealing with. They want to enslave a servile population, not slaughter it. If we make it clear that we're united and coordinated in our resistance, then they won't be able to just pick off one marginalized group. And then when the violence starts to affect the dominant white male cultural group, whose cooperation they need the most, notice how Fox News only started critiquing ICE after the death of Alex Preddy, then they'll have to change tactics. So that's part 2. We're united and courageous, we make the threat, and we stand by it. But then we come to the third point, which is what a lot of people miss and what we don't talk nearly enough about. The full statement is, if you don't do what we want, the demand, then we will remove our power and stop supporting you, the threat, and instead we will put our power behind something or someone else. That's the third crucial ingredient. There has to be an alternative. Without an alternative, your threat is not credible. In a negotiation, they call this a BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The stronger your BATNA, the stronger your negotiating position. For example, in a job offer negotiation, if you're trying to get more money, it helps for you to mention that you have another job offer available. Because then they know that if they don't offer you a higher salary, then you won't work for them, they can't use you, and instead you will go work for someone else. That other job offer is your BATNA. Having an alternative is what makes your threat serious. They must meet your demand in order to get your cooperation. To see how this plays out when it comes to activism, let's take the classic American example of the civil rights movement. First, the Montgomery bus boycott. The strategy was, if you do not desegregate the buses, notice that's a specific demand, then we will remove ourselves and not give you our economic power, so we will not buy seats on the bus. And instead, we will organize carpools and walking groups so that we can get around in other ways. They built alternative institutions to manage and channel their power within their own community. That third element is the part that modern-day calls for boycotts completely miss. They were not just asking everyone to individually make the decision to not buy something. They were coming together as a community to organize, envision new ways of operating, support each other, and to make sure that they had alternative ways to get their needs met. In this case, their transportation needs. And to make sure that no one was walking alone, because if you were walking alone, you are more likely to be attacked. Boycotting for one day is easy. Striking for a day is not too hard. It's a start, but the Montgomery bus boycott took over a year before it was effective. When we withdraw from their system, we need to give the impression that our withdrawal could last an indefinite amount of time. They're not just going to be able to wait us out. If they don't treat us right, we will move on and live our lives without them. Period. I said what I said. That means building alternative bases of power outside of our current systems and political parties so that we have the independent infrastructure to completely go our own way. So we're gonna need strike funds, mutual aid groups, lists of small local businesses who we do want to support, local political leaders who aren't in the pockets of corporations, alternative communications platforms and digital systems. Movements have to be built. This is part of what it means to build a congruent democracy, a system based in fundamental human equality, the kind of equality that I explained in this video, where we the people can actually work together and govern ourselves without being dependent on wealthy elites. Building that kind of system is absolutely possible. It's already happening in small pockets across the country. It's happening in the self-organization in Minneapolis. It's being dreamed up by unorthodox economists and political theorists. The ideas are out there, they're just not being talked about in the mainstream. That's part of my mission on this channel, to tell the truth about our current systems, to talk about the alternatives, and to imagine democratic possibilities. If we can understand how our current systems of power actually work, including their specific flaws, then it becomes clear how we could construct new systems that actually deliver liberty and justice for all. If you want to help me achieve that mission, because writing about complex systems in a way that's easy to understand takes me a lot of time, then I would love to have your support. You can support my work monthly on Patreon or buy me a coffee as a one-time contribution. Links to both are in the description and the comments. If we don't pose a credible threat and have alternative systems to back up that threat, then the people in power are going to continue to do whatever the heck they want. And it wasn't just about having alternatives during the boycott. There are 3 additional layers of alternatives that played into making the civil rights movement successful. First, there was alternative leadership. I'm a Dr. King type person myself, but the alternative to Dr. King was Malcolm X. On the one hand, the US government had the peaceful Negro, respectfully asking for a seat at the table. And on the other hand, they had the by any means necessary Negro, the we will smash your table, burn this whole place down, and take you with us Negro. So maybe talk to the peaceful Negro, because we don't want the black community turning to the alternative. The alternative made the threat real. It's the good cop, bad cop effect. Scholars of activist movements call this the radical flank effect. Yes, the main thrust of the movement should be nonviolent. And again, I'm a nonviolence person myself. At the same time, history shows us that it doesn't hurt to have a radical flank. Second, there was an alternative political party. At the time that the civil rights movement kicked off, both leading political parties were viable alternatives for black voters. The civil rights movement started in the mid-1950s. The Supreme Court ruled on Brown v. Board of Education to desegregate schools in 1954, and the Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955. At that point, both parties had been ambivalent on issues of civil rights, so neither party could take the black vote for granted. If anything, Republicans had the edge. After all, they were the party of Lincoln. After the Brown decision, Eisenhower had federally enforced desegregation of schools, and Nixon had supported the Civil Rights Act of 1957. And Nixon actually had a personal friendship with Dr. King. So, when the 1960 election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon came around, black voters were actually up for grabs. And that's when JFK took a political risk and made a phone call that changed history. It was October 26th, less than 2 weeks before the election, and Dr. King had been thrown into a particularly rough jail in Georgia after his latest political action. His life was at risk. Both presidential candidates had received petitions from leading civil rights groups asking them to speak out against the imprisonment. Nixon's campaign, not wanting to alienate the Southern white vote, made the political calculation that silence was more strategic. He made no statement and did nothing to help King. So much for friendship. Kennedy's campaign had also been trying to not alienate the Southern white vote, which made black folks skeptical of Kennedy's civil rights commitment. In this moment, Kennedy made the opposite political calculation. It was a risk, but it was also an opportunity to gain an outpouring of black support. So Kennedy took action. Not only did Kennedy secretly back-channel with the governor of Georgia to get King released from jail, he also made a call to King's pregnant wife, Coretta, expressing his sympathy and his willingness to help. Word of Kennedy's phone call to Coretta got out to the press, King was released from jail, and black voters turned out for Kennedy in droves, even in the South where voting rights were restricted. Given how close the election was, it's likely that Kennedy's phone call to Coretta won him the election. With that, black folks switched their primary allegiance from Republicans to Democrats. And with King and black folks holding them accountable, the Democratic Party, led by Lyndon B. Johnson after Kennedy's assassination, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the law that finally allowed all citizens to have access to the vote. Temporarily, at least. The law was recently gutted by the Supreme Court, but that's a different story. The Democratic Party took action on civil rights, maybe because of their conscience, but definitely because they were trying to win black votes. And they had to do the work of winning them over because black people had a viable alternative. This is part of why I talk about needing third parties. I plan to make a whole other video about the possibilities for third parties, and yes, I know it would take more than just building the party itself. If you want to make sure that you see that future video, then be sure to subscribe to my email newsletter so you get notified when I put new things out. As things stand today, the Democratic Party can hold us hostage using the Republican Party as their weapon of choice, because we have no other viable options. Chuck Schumer has made it clear that their strategy is to watch Trump's approval numbers fall while emphasizing that they are the anti-Trump alternative. That's like waiting to hear someone scream loud enough from the torture and then saying, if you want the torture to stop, then you'll submit to me. That isn't leadership, that's cruel and unusual punishment. Between the pro-democracy coalition and our representatives, we're the ones facing the bigger threat, not them. If we want to reverse that power dynamic, then we need to build our own external bases of power. Of course, in the short term, the only logical response is to vote against being tortured. As I said before the last general election in this video about how democracy is a spectrum, liberal oligarchy is better than fascism. But neither of those is actually democracy. If we the people want our needs to be met, then we need to get out of this hostage situation. Yes, that's going to be difficult. Just like getting out of any hostage situation is difficult, but it's also our best chance at survival. And the third additional layer of alternatives that positively impacted the civil rights movement was that internationally there was a communist alternative. Now, I'm not pro-communism, I'm for economic democracy. I explained why in this video about how the free market is a scam. But during the civil rights movement, it helped that the US had competition from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and supporters of communism could look at the US and say, America, you call yourselves a democracy? You say you're about liberty and justice for all? You're running an apartheid state. In our system, we're not treating people like they're second-class citizens because of the color of their skin. You're using democracy talk as a smokescreen to mask racial capitalist systems of domination. Given the obvious failings of the US system and how rapidly the Soviet Union developed its economy and transformed into a military superpower, it looked at the time like there could be a more desirable alternative on the world stage, one that could earn the support of disenfranchised Black Americans. That's a national security threat. And Black diplomats from other countries reported coming to America and receiving abominable treatment. Americans were proving themselves to be hypocrites on the world stage, and now they had international competition. There was an alternative. So American leaders felt the pressure to address their domestic issues and maintain their allies and global prestige. So, on several levels, from the individual boycott to the leaders of the movement to political parties to the international order, there were real, viable alternatives. These alternatives were essential to the victories of the civil rights movement. That's what we need to build, not just persuasion. Persuasion is to get the public on your side so you can expand your coalition and increase your people power. To get the leaders to act right, you need to use that people power to apply pressure. Like the movement building in Minneapolis, you don't just march with signs. You obstruct the current system. You block state terrorism. You economically withdraw. You refuse to obey. You build alternative organization and networks within your own community. So that's the three-part power move. Have a clear demand, make a credible threat, and have an alternative. Historically, that's been the effective approach to securing radical social change. I'm just telling you how it works. You can decide for yourself whether it's time to get to work. If not, you could limit your protests to the weekends, be civilly obedient to unjust laws, and continue leaving voice messages on your representatives' answering machines, hoping that they'll change their ways. The choice is up to you. I'll let you make up your own mind. Think about it. If you like this approach to democratic social change and you want to dig a little deeper, check out my pro-democracy reading guide, which I'll link below. There's a whole section with books on how we can strategically harness our people power. In the meantime, remember to think critically and creatively, and I will see you next time. Pressure.